Hello and welcome. My guest today is Ron Quist. Ron is an international development specialist. Uh, and this intro is off the top of my head, so I'm going to say he's a jack of many trades and master of many. Uh, as you will see, he's written a memoir, like I said. The title of the memoir is Such Weather Conditions, the Kanplay Incident. Uh, he worked in Liberia and was arrested in Kanplay, accused of being a CIA spy. Never mind that he's Ghanaian, and got away. And that is the backdrop, really, for a story about development and development issues in Africa. Ron, hello and welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very glad to participate in your podcast, Octavius. Okay. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. So let's do this as an icebreaker, Ron. Tell me a little bit about what life was like when you were born in Ghana, and how did you end up in Liberia?
I was born just shy of 2 years before Ghana gained its independence. And so I grew up in the heady days post-independence where the country was very, very hopeful about its future. The dividend of freedom gained through our independence was something we were all eager and looking forward to. Of course, as I grew up, my early years, I was unaware of these dimensions. I wasn't sophisticated enough to understand that yet. However, I think I absorbed the enthusiasm, the excitement, the energy of the period. I think it was well captioned in our national anthem. First two lines at the time, unfortunately, from my perspective, it's been changed since, but it was at the time, lift high the flag of Ghana and make our nation great and strong. These are two lines I would belt out each morning at school, primary school that is, and tended to interpret those words literally, that my life was to be dedicated to making my nation great and strong. In some ways, if you will, it was what began to carve out my interest in development. I should share with you, Octavius, that I didn't have an articulated sense of what development was. I was moving along the path of development without really being able to define for you what development was. But I was interested in my country growing, developing, becoming wealthier, and seeing fewer and fewer of my countrymen living in, if I'm to put it honestly, abject poverty. So there was a real awareness of that. I started off school in a Catholic private school called Christ the King International School. It turns out that that school was right across from the front gate of Flagstaff House, which was the seat of government. Today it's referred to as Jubilee House, but at the time it was referred to as Flagstaff House. I think also important to that development and what I would dedicate my life to was that there were children from all over the world. In my interpretation, they were there to participate in this great adventure of development that Ghana had set itself upon. So we had children from India, from Pakistan, from Trinidad, from New Zealand, Australia, Canada, United Kingdom, Germany, Austria, Netherlands. I don't know if I've said it already, the United States. So there was this melting point of energy. Again, as I said, my focus was, apart from singing the national anthem, was soccer and getting my homework done and trying to pass my tests. So it wasn't a discussion about development or African unity or anything like that. But I think it was an environment that encouraged that would be my adult focus. There were many visitors who came to Ghana at that time that the newspapers told me were very important. There was Juin Lai, There was Lee Kuan Yew, Brezhnev, the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II. There was Maya Angelou, who lived with us, W.E.B. Du Bois, who lived with us in Accra. We got a visit from Malcolm X. So it just seemed, from my schoolboy sense, to be the center of the earth. And
when you say live with us, as in spending time in your home?
Sorry.
When you say lived with us,
Oh,
you mean
lived in
spending
Accra
time
with
in your
us.
home? Okay.
Lived in Accra with us. Accra was a small city or town, if you will, at the time. I believe our population in the early 60s was about 800,000 people.
Okay.
Today it's 4 or 5 million, maybe even more. It's a large, sprawling city. Very, very different character at the time. So these weren't people that I bumped into, but these were people who appeared in our newspapers. These were
Okay.
people that I heard my parents talk about. And so there was a real awareness of important people being part of our community.
So most of our viewers are in Liberia and in the diaspora, the Liberian diaspora. How did you end up in Liberia? I know before coming to Liberia, you had gone, well, you studied physics in Ghana, went to Canada, and then ended up in Liberia. How did you end up in Liberia?
I'll give a short an answer as I can. It turned out that in 1966, Ghana experienced its first coup d'etat, which overthrew Kwame Nkrumah. Irrespective of whether you consider that a positive act or a negative act, what can't be denied is that it started us on a path of economic decline. And so over the next years, Ghana would begin to suffer real economic hardship. So by the time my generation, got to university, much of our energies were focused on how we could leave Ghana and leave Ghana for good, because it didn't seem to have prospects for our future. At the time, there seemed to be some countries in Africa that were doing well and others that were not. In my simple-mindedness, I seemed to categorize them between countries that were flirting with socialism, such as my own Ghana, Zambia, Tanzania, and all those seem to be having very serious challenges in terms of the economy, their economies, and other countries that leaned more towards capitalism and seemed to be doing better. And they included Kenya, they included Nigeria. Nigeria was significant because it had had a coup as well, and yet did not seem to have been derailed as far as Ghana was derailed. So I didn't necessarily attribute the decline to the coup d'etat, but the fact that we had flirted with socialism. Liberia was in the category of capitalism, and more important, the currency in Liberia was the almighty dollar. And given the very, very high inflation that we had experienced in Ghana, some periods much higher than 100%, 100% was the official figures. The experience feel was more like 200% and more. It would be a very, very big draw. I went to graduate school in Canada, a country which in many ways I enjoyed very much. I learned a lot in graduate school. It gave me a confidence about my approach to learning, my approach to understanding. But there were a couple of things that discouraged me from attempting to make a life in Canada. I think the most overwhelming one was one that surprised me, and that was my inability to cope with the racism, that rejection from society, that feeling of isolation, feeling of not being able to participate within society in a meaningful way. It's the way that it registered with me, made it very difficult for me to see a future there. And I should also acknowledge and admit that working on my PhD seemed to be a repetition of my master's thesis. I didn't really feel that through the research, I was learning that much more. I think my consideration at the time was rather narrow in that the experiments that I was doing was pretty much the same. I wasn't learning any new experimental technique, but I was applying that technique to a broad array of related materials. And I think it would have been possible to discover some fairly interesting patterns for an array of materials. I think I missed that point and just thought, I can't spend the next 3 years of my life doing exactly the same experiments I've been doing for the last year and a half. It didn't seem like progress to me. So with all of these things combined, I thought I wanted to go back to Africa. And as I said, Liberia being capitalistic, so it wasn't suffering the kind of decline that Ghana was. The fact that they used the almighty dollar, if in fact I had made a mistake in leaving graduate school, I'd be able to use my savings probably to come back. If I'd gone into Ghana, even if I'd saved up a lot of CDs, there were all kinds of exchange controls. The CD was in decline. It might make it very, very complicated to ever leave Ghana again. It's a long-winded story, but that's how I ended up focusing on trying to get a job in Liberia. I applied to LAMCO and I applied to the Liberia Electricity Corporation, which we all refer to as LEC. Almost nobody called it the Liberia Electricity Corporation. So it was LAMCO and LEC. LEC did invite me for an interview. LAMCO did not make an offer, declined, wished me well.
Okay, what were your first impressions? You arrived in Monrovia for the interview. What was your initial sense of the country at that time?
This might surprise you. I think the biggest surprise I had, I might even call it a shock, and this, I suspect, will surprise you too, given that I'm from Ghana. First thing that hit me was the heat and the humidity. I don't know if my stay in Canada had changed the makeup of my blood. They talk about thickness and thinning of blood. I don't know, but that was truly a big surprise for me. I didn't expect to feel that way as I stepped off the plane. I came to a country or a city, Monrovia, that was vibrant, that seemed to be on the move. This, when I arrived, it was just after the OAU conference that was held in Monrovia. I think there was still quite a lot of spillover excitement from that. There had been a lot of work that LEC itself had been involved with in terms of improving the roads, building new bridges. There's a lot more street lighting in the city. And that excitement was very, very much in the air. So I found Liberia to be very attractive. It just felt like it was a country on the move, and I was hoping to be a part of that move.
So you get an interview at LEC, you get a job. What were some of the projects you were involved in, and who were some of the people you worked with at the time?
I'm not sure it was that simple about having an interview and having a job. I actually had a number of interviews.
Okay.
And from my own judgment, I was failing in all of them.
Okay.
My background and training is in physics, and the LEC environment was a very can-do electrical engineering environment. It was an organization that was energized to try and keep their circuits, their generators online and keep their circuits live. So there was a lot of radio activity, practical activity, action at different substations, action, different generating switching networks back and forth. It was a very hands-on environment. My own strengths were rather theoretical and were far from conventional electrical engineering. I felt I had a very large toolbox in terms of I had a number of techniques that could be applied, but I had no knowledge of the Liberia Electricity Corporation. There were lots of details that came natural to anyone who'd been interviewing me that I had no idea about. I don't want to sound defensive, but there was no internet at the time. So in terms of my preparation for these interviews, I had come across a single annual report, which is, I think, about 2 years old, and did not offer all that much. It was my last interview with Mr. Lionel Keller, who was manager for planning, where we resonated with each other, that many of the things that we were discussing was about where the LEC could go, what kinds of developments would be necessary to get it to be able to be a critical part of the industrialization of the country. And it is only at that point that I felt that maybe I'm not doing as badly as with the others. And I think it went very well because immediately Mr. Keller put me in his car and drove me to the managing director's office and said bluntly in front of me, I think we can use this young man. And it was then that things changed.
And you spoke earlier of having a large toolbox. You were not an engineer by training, you studied physics. What were some of the things in that toolbox that either immediately or later on came in handy in your work at LEC?
Okay. I think they would, important ones would include my ability for estimating in an environment where data was not necessarily readily available. So the techniques for generating estimates when you don't have clear data, I think was a powerful tool I brought in. My computing skills, my mathematical skills, so my ability to calculate, develop models. I think my physics training allowed me to look at what might be considered a complex system and identify the key variables that drove the outcomes on that system, model them, test them, and apply them. I think it was in that respect that I was bringing real tools that could be applied, especially to planning. Planning is about forecasting. Planning is about looking into the future. And this is done with models. The data was not always available. I came to Liberia in 1979. And if I remember correctly, the earliest data we had on power generation went back to 1961. When you're dealing with sort of just 18 data points, it does take quite a lot of massaging and statistical analysis to get it to talk to you.
So Mr. Keller says to the managing director at the time, I think we can use this young man. What were some of the initial projects they assigned you to, and what were some of the highlights of your career at LEC?
I think the first application that I recall in the planning department was a dispatch model for generation. The economics of dispatch is very much dependent upon the different technologies and how you load your generators up to the particular value of power that the network has. Each and every different generator type you have has a different set of economics, and how you bring that together to maintain an optimum in the aggregation does require some analysis. And so that was the very, very first major thing that I worked upon. I got a lot of help in terms of me being taught about the Liberia Electricity Corporation from two young engineers, Joseph Maya, who would eventually become managing director of the Liberia Electricity Corporation, and Mr. Henry Lewis. He, very shortly after I arrived, moved out of the planning department and into what they call the transmission T&D department. but they were very, very helpful in getting me to at least understand the basics of the network. To begin to, in order to understand it, you need to know the city, because I didn't really know Monrovia. I also did not know the network, and they were patient with me. I asked questions, and they took me around. Shortly after the first 2 or 3 months, we started working on the St. Paul River Hydro Project. This is a project that had been worked on for some years before. And in fact, Stanley engineers had built the Mount Coffee Dam, and this is one of the dams that were part of the larger St. Paul Hydro Project. LEC had recruited the services of a Boston company called CT Main, Chastity Main, and they were doing feasibility studies. My job was to interact with them, assist them in developing those studies, and critiquing them once they were completed and submitted, and recommending to my manager what were the areas that needed to be revisited and expanded upon.
So the title of the memoir is Such Were the Conditions, the Kanplay Incident. So you're now in Monrovia. Why did you go to Kanplay, and what really happened in Kanplay?
All right. If I can step back a little bit to
Sure.
just describe my motivation for writing the book in the first place, and then that will put the Kanplay incident in some perspective. I think the first part of the title, Such Were the Conditions, is, if you will, an appeal to the younger generation and the coming generations to understand the context in which we operated, given that we started off with a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of hope about what the post-independence period would bring, only to end up feeling very disappointed, somewhat baffled as to where all that opportunity went. And so to explain to the coming generations that these were the conditions we experienced. Now, looking at that period, or trying to answer that question, suggests that we must discuss development, Africa's development, and its failure to meet the hopes and expectations of our generation. I worked as a development professional for about 20 years. I worked in a number of countries, including Afghanistan, Vanuatu, Fiji, Vietnam, Thailand, South Africa, Botswana, Nigeria, Kenya. The list goes on and on and on and on. And one of the things I discovered was I would write reports. If I may say so, I felt those reports were important, but would discover I would be lucky if 3 or 4 people read those reports. All of that information and that analysis was going nowhere. Why? I would suggest to you because those reports became the prerequisites, the requirements for the disbursement of donor funds. So the attitude was, look, the report is done, or the feasibility is done, the project report is completed. Can we have our money now? Is there any real need to read it and understand it? I'm being a little bit facetious, but the lesson I got from that was that probably development analysis, development thesis are a little too boring, too dry, maybe too technical for most. So if I were merely to write a book that attempted to address development and do so directly, maybe I would grow the readership from 3 to 5. But that wasn't something I was going to look forward to. Something, though, I noticed was that my own life, with its starts and stops, its trauma and derailment, might be considered a metaphor for Africa's own truncated development trajectory. So I could use, I thought, a memoir as a device for lay people to access the issues of development in an interesting way, so that, if you will, my personal story became or becomes a, a typifying of many African stories of my generation. It is our story. And through that, gives us a lens through which we can begin to explore development in Africa. We can look to development, understand our failures through the lens of a life. So, in terms of what was the most dramatic event in my life, much like you might compare a country having a coup or a civil war as the most dramatic event in its development trajectory, I went with another Liberian engineer, Mr. Ian Yap, who also worked at Liberia Electricity Corporation. We'd become very close friends. And after a trip to Canada, I had an opportunity to explore the exportation of coffee to Canada in an arrangement that seemed would be profitable and sustainable. And I started this project off on my own, looking for sourcing coffee green beans and looking for a way to export it. One of the people I brought this up with was with Ian Yap. And he said, look, our family has a coffee farm. We haven't worked it for 10 years because my mother passed away. It was her coffee farm. But I think it's something that can be revived. And this coffee farm was in Kanplay. I got very excited about that. And we worked out an arrangement where I would make an investment and obtain an interest in that farm. We developed the farm together. We do our harvests and we would ship to Canada. And I would learn that Liberia had a rich tradition in coffee growing and in coffee exports that went back 100 years. And so it seemed the right type of thing to get involved with. I had also learned that many of my senior managers had rubber farms, or they had oil palm farms. They all had weekend farms. And it just made good sense. It coincided with my idea of what African development would involve. It wouldn't just be about technology, about power sector planning, but it would also be about agricultural development, which is, if you will, the most foundational block of any development. So that took us up to Kahnplay. I won't go into all of the details because that's much of what the book is centered around and tells the story much better than I can at this point. But I think, as you mentioned, we were arrested for me being a Jamaican CIA spy who had come to Kanplay to recruit and train mercenaries and insurgents to overthrow the government of Liberia. We faced a military tribunal and we were both sentenced to death. Of course, I'm living, so there are important things that happen between the sentence to death and today. And that particular traumatic event, if you will, derailed my own career path. At that time, I had lived in Liberia for a little over a year. I felt very comfortable. Unlike Canada, where I didn't feel accepted, Liberians seemed to accept me very, very well. They treated me as if I were one of them. So I had every expectation that I would make my life there. But after my Kanplay experience, I reevaluated what I could do in Liberia and to what extent it would be accepted. and decided that it was time to leave. So after 2 years in Liberia, and it was a direct consequence of the Kahnplay incident.
So you leave Liberia. Now, where did you go to? After Liberia, where did you go to? Boston, I understand?
Yes.
Okay.
I left Liberia and initially went to Canada. There was a possibility of a job offer with a power consulting company in Montreal. It turns out I was really very, very naive about immigration requirements. I thought that with my resume and the fact that I had a Canadian education would be enough for a company to grant me employment and arrange to have a work visa. It turned out it wasn't quite that simple, and the company was not willing to go through hoops that would be necessary to do so. My father was a green card holder. He had emigrated to the United States from Ghana in 1968 when I was quite a small boy. I hadn't been in touch with my father for many, many years, but it turned out that just the previous year I had arranged to go and meet him, and we had reestablished, made a connection, reestablished our relationship. So I asked him if it would be okay, would he be willing to sponsor me? And he said yes. So I moved from Montreal. This was only after a few weeks. I didn't live in Montreal very long, to Boston. My father at the time was in Nigeria. He lived in upstate New York when he lived in the United States, but he had moved to a position for an American firm in Lagos in Nigeria. And my good friend Ian Yap was doing a secondment with CT Main in Boston. So I decided to go to Boston, and I knew some of the people who worked at CT Main. It seemed a good starting point to see if I could make my life in the United States through Boston.
And what was life like in Boston? There were, according to the book, you had a reasonably successful spell, and then you fell on hard times.
Yes. My priority this time, as opposed to how I approached Canada, was to seek out a immigration attorney, and item number one, try to get a green card or at least get a work permit to start working. It turns out that process would be far more complicated than I thought it would be. The process took much, much longer. Even though I felt that I had arrived in the United States with sufficient funds to make my life there, I quickly found out that I ran out of money, and I ended up homeless on the streets of Boston, trying to reconcile two different experiences within the same life. 8 months or so earlier, the Liberia Electricity Corporation had put me in one of the presidential villas at Hotel Africa. And now I was a homeless bum walking the streets and the parks of Cambridge, Somerville, and Boston. Quite a traumatic shock for a young man of 26. I was concerned about working illegally and being found out, and that might jeopardize my application for a green card, which seemed to be, I thought, straightforward, but it turned out it was far more complicated than that. Eventually, mainly with the help of Mr. Edwin Holder, or shall I say the emotional support, it was an application that was sponsored by my father. That didn't change, but just the dealing with the hoops that I had to go through in terms of submitting documentation, taking the application from Boston and submitting it in New York, and then things started moving very, very smoothly. So I do have to thank Edwin Holder for that. Edwin, a Liberian who was living in the United States, had moved there in about 1961, if I recall correctly. So in 1982, I believe it was August, I eventually got a work permit. I immediately got a job because there was a person who was waiting for me to offer me that job, Mr. Richard LeCapra. He had just started up an energy consulting firm, and I was his first employee.
Hire. So,
so eventually it worked out all right. In fact, it worked out very, very well, but it was quite harrowing to walk the streets of Boston with no future, no money, and no place to stay.
The other interesting person you run into while you were in Boston was none other than Mr. Charles Taylor. What were the circumstances? It piques my interest because a lot of people would have completely excluded him from the story, given the way how his life ended up. But instead of shying away and just putting everything, you didn't have to include him in the story, but you meet him under interesting circumstances.
Yes. Mr. Ian Yap was very, very worried about me. He would be in Boston for a period of 6 months. And so by the time he was ready to leave, to go back to Liberia, he knew his good friend, me, was in trouble. And he also knew a little bit about my personality, rather introverted, sometimes a little too proud for my own good. He knew I was the kind of person who probably would not ask for help. So he convinced me. He said, look, I'm going to introduce you to someone, and you can help them out. I'm sure they'll throw you a few dollars until you sort yourself out. So I wasn't totally comfortable with that, but he told me an interesting story that I recount in the book that convinced me. And it just had to do with the social attitudes in America versus the social attitudes in Africa. It is much easier to be a poor man in Africa and still expect a couple of meals a day than to be a poor man in the United States.
In America.
He had this very graphic story that brought it home for me. So he took me to Somerville to see Edwin Holder. Edwin Holder was running a company called Green Coast Export and Import. And they were doing business with Liberia, supplying them with equipment, etc. And Ian did a wonderful job of marketing my abilities. I had never worked in an import-export, but by the time Ian finished recounting my possibilities, I was convinced I would be crucial to the operation. And Edwin was very, very friendly. He took to me immediately. I liked him a lot too. He's very, very funny. Probably one of the most funny gentlemen I've ever come across. And it's exactly the type of personality I needed. I wasn't quite hopeless at the time, but my future was looking very, very bleak. So to be able to go somewhere and laugh every single day helped greatly to my mental well-being. It turns out that Green Coast was itself in dire straits, and my employment at $300 a week lasted exactly 1 week. Where Edwin explained, look, fella, there ain't no more money. So let me just tell you straight, it ain't going to happen. But it was a home to go to. It was getting to winter, and it was somewhere I could go every day, banter with the gentlemen, etc. About 4 months or 5 months into this, a gentleman came to the shop. It was mid-morning, very well dressed in a silk suit, red tie, very expensive watch, and a lot of confidence. And he opens the door and he steps in. And from the door, he kind of shouts, "Where's that boy who's been sending me all those proposals?" I suspected he meant me. I was in the back of the room.
So you had been sending proposals on Edwin Holder's behalf to GSA Monrovia?
Exactly. I was doing the work that Ian had described that I was so good at. So this is basically sourcing equipment, pricing for shipping, etc., plus a margin, putting in a description as to why that particular type of equipment or that configuration or design of implementation of equipment was appropriate or was advantageous. And he looked at me. I'm not quite sure whether Edwin had told him my circumstance or I was looking so bad, my clothes, my demeanor, I'm not sure. But he said something about how sad it was for gifted Africans like me to be living in the gutter in the United States. How sad that was. And he stuck his hand in his pocket and he gave me $1,000. A man who had never met me before, didn't really know me. I was very, very touched by that. And he didn't stay in the States very long. He went back to Liberia. But later that year, he would himself run into trouble in Liberia and moved to Boston for about 6 months before he was incarcerated in southern Massachusetts, in Plymouth, Massachusetts. We got quite acquainted. I got to know him a little bit. Yes.
And he left Liberia. He left Liberia under some unusual circumstances at that time. I think there was allegations that he had basically stolen some money from the then president Samuel Doe. He had embezzled some money. In the book, I was surprised to learn that is, according to you, that is not how the story went. Taylor brought the money to a businessman. The man took the money as payment for whatever balance the government of Liberia owed him at the time. Is it true, first of all? Is my recollection from the book correct?
It is, yes. When these things happened, I'd already left Liberia, so I wouldn't know, if you will, the first-hand story as it unfolds in Liberia. But what I do know is that he was pursuing an Indian who had run an operation in Liberia, had gone back to the States, to fulfill that order. And I drove him down to New Jersey to meet this man. He was completely frustrated. Mr. Dillon's argument was the government owed him for other supplies and had never paid him. So as far as he was concerned, he was taking this check to offset.
How much was the check? How much money was that?
I believe there were two shipments which added up to a little over $900,000. So it was just shy of $1 million, $910,000 or $920,000, something like that. So that conversation that evening and his complete frustration did not sound like someone who had received money or that he had gone there to say, hey, let me pick up my share of this. It was that your action has put me in trouble. If you don't ship back to Liberia, I'm going to be in very, very serious trouble. So I know that label has stuck with him, but it runs directly contradictory to the direct experience that I had in terms of his conversation with Mr. Dillon.
You would run into him later on in Monrovia, but that's down the road in the story. So be that as it may, you're in Boston. Things did not work out. They worked out a little bit when you went to work for La Capra, I believe. And then why did you decide to go back to Ghana?
A good question. I guess a whole host of factors that I had suppressed in me, but probably in some way similar to what drove me from Canada to go to Liberia. It turns out that I became very, very successful by my standards, much more successful than my boyhood dreams in Accra would have ever suggested. I Started up a company in 1985, and it did extremely well. We had clients in Belgium, in the UK, in Germany, in Italy, across the top of the 5 New England states plus New York. We're a small company, but doing extremely, extremely well financially. And especially starting off from my homelessness, the rejection I felt from the society, I would always internalize as no worries. They are rejecting me because I deserve to be rejected. My clothes aren't very good. I'm a bum. There's no one who really knows the huge toolbox I carry within me from the outside. Why would anyone pay attention to me? So I had this idea that as I recovered and as I became successful, I would start to be accepted more. And I found it was almost the exact opposite. It was almost as if the more successful I got, the worse I was treated. A very strange phenomenon. I had my own explanations for that. So while, if you will, the money was too good and I didn't have any other plans, I wasn't sure that I could grow old in the United States. Something would have to give. It turns out that I met a German woman who I would eventually marry. I met her in Germany, and I brought her back to the United States. Another somewhat strange phenomenon, since I tended to frame all of my arguments in terms of race. She was blonde, she was blue-eyed, and she disliked America even more than I did. And that social rejection, she was receiving social rejection as well, for different reasons. She spoke English with a very, very heavy Germanic accent, which was often interpreted as Russian. So, so she was treated as a pinko commie. And so both of us, I didn't know that I could function in Germany because I can't speak the language. I'm hopeless at languages. I couldn't see that. Anyway, so this was an ongoing discussion we had. And in August of 1988, she and I decided to take a holiday to Ghana. And this time, my impression of Ghana was very, very different. Not so much that Ghana had changed that much, but now I had the experience of being entrepreneurial. I felt fairly confident. I had technical skills. I had financial management skills. I had marketing and sales skills that would allow me to survive in almost any environment. And I didn't feel it would be necessary to shut down my operations in the States. I could expand out into Ghana. My company provided computer services, computer training, computer maintenance, and software development, database management. Those seem to be in very, very high demand in Ghana. Ghana was just starting along that line, and it just seemed that I would have a huge advantage in that environment. And my wife really, really liked the warmth, the acceptance in Ghana. You know, we have a very special way of treating people. We really make them feel at home. I felt very proud to be Ghanaian. I felt true love. So I got back to the States. I found it even harder to accept all of the rejection that I was feeling. And so made up my mind, well, let's go back to Ghana. And she was supportive of that. So we did. It turns out that I was not able to continue. I did for about a year and a half, but I was not able to continue operating my company in the States without my being there myself. So I did shut down that operation and focused solely on Ghana.
So you arrive in Ghana, natural born Ghanaian, of course, with some Liberian experience, some American experience. How challenging or easy was it to reestablish yourself in Ghana?
The early months were very, very simple. I picked up a growing number of clients. I felt that the work I was doing was having a discernible impact. So I felt very comfortable. I soon would find out. Let me take a couple of steps back because I don't want to sound totally naive. In the States, when I thought about returning home, I had a simplistic formula in my mind. I said, well, I go to Ghana, the market is going to be much, much smaller than the market that I'm dealing in. So I'll be lucky if I can do 25% of the business. Then I said, I don't want to be involved in corruption because I think it undermines development, and my true passion is development. So I'm not going to enter into a practice that undermines what I really would like to focus my energies on. And that probably means I'll only do about a quarter of the business, because many people will say, no, if you're not willing to let me know what's in it for me, I don't see why I should give you a contract. We need to help each other, even though I saw it somewhat differently. So a quarter of a quarter would be about 1/16th. And when I took my US revenues, divided it by 1/16th, I said, that's okay. I can live with this. I'll be happier. I'll be doing something important, and it'll work out fine. What I discovered within about a year and a half in Ghana was that if you were not willing to play the bribe game, your market would not be 1/4 of its full potential. It would be zero. No one would do it. And it was a small community, relatively speaking. So it took about a year for the word to get out that Ron Quist could not be trusted. You can't do business with Ron Quist because he doesn't know how to play the game. He doesn't know how we do things in these parts. And so after maybe 3 or 4 years, my Ghana business essentially dried up.
So was it at that point that you created the software, the Deal Master and the Treasury Master software?
I did the first version of the software Deal Master, which was a fixed income securities trading platform.
Okay, so hold on just a minute. Let's break that down into ordinary English for someone who might not be aware of how that whole thing operates.
So these would be instruments like government treasury bills, bonds. They would be characterized as bills for those instruments that had a tenor of a year or less, and as bonds for a tenor extending beyond a year. Now, what is different about fixed income security instruments is that unlike shares, whose value varies daily and has a different value, fixed income securities, yes, their value changes in a secondary market as they're traded, but in terms of the primary market, the face value is maintained throughout the entire tenor. So if you invest in a $100 treasury bill and it's discounted at 10%, then it means you invest $90 and you get a paper whose face value is $100. And if you ride it out till the end of the year, then for your $90 investment, you get $100 back. Now, that instrument can be traded anyway. If somebody was desperate for cash, really desperate, and was sitting on face value of 100 and said, look, give me $80. I need that $80 and you can take this. You can pick up $100 at the end of the year. Then it means that its value in the trade was $80, but that's in a secondary market. And this was software that managed that process, that monitored that process, that tracked that process, and that reported on that process. Now, the Ghana implementation, there was a lot of pressure on us to build within it the ability for the traders to do what we call kululu, which is a way of trading into their own companies
Wow.
to make money, which changed the risk profiles. Again, just a very unfortunate situation, made me extremely uncomfortable. Decided not to work on that. The only good thing was that a Nigerian wholesale bank, a discount house to be technically precise, came to get training from the Ghanaian discount house. And they saw the performance of our software and they liked it. They had evaluated a number of software from the UK and they just felt that this really met their needs. So I was invited to Lagos, did a presentation. There were some very interesting things in that particular event that I narrate in the book that taught me a lot. And I think it says a lot about Nigerian business. And so I spent the next 17 or 18 years supporting that software in Nigeria. It was a very, very successful transaction for us. But Octavius, I think something I should share with you. At the time of that transaction, the contract with Nigeria, I was so jaded by all of this corruption that I was having to navigate and deal with. And the conventional wisdom was, if corruption in Ghana was X, corruption in Nigeria was 5 times X.
X. Wow.
It would be even worse. So when I set up the contract with Nigeria, I insisted that they pay 80% upfront because I didn't trust them. They acceded to that and they paid 80%. It turns out the Nigerian market is not only different from the Ghana market, it's also more sophisticated. So we would have to tear up our software and rewrite it in order for it to operate in the Nigerian market. So here I was, I demanded 80% upfront, yet we had a piece of software that was that was not yet ready. So for about a month and a half, it was we who were the corrupt ones. We had taken money and didn't yet have a software that would work. Thank goodness we were able to catch up and we were able to deliver very, very successful software for them. Treasury Master was developed about 2 years later, and that was just a massive improvement on Deal Master.
So, like I said, from the onset, this is a conversation about development, right? Let's take a stop here at corruption and then look at how it impacts development, not just in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Liberia, most of the developing world for that matter. I like the fact that in the book, you draw a distinction between corruption that is obvious and clear cut and corruption that is not so clear. You talk about, for instance, political promises versus the reality in education. That might not be so clear cut, whereas kulu or giving somebody money for a favor is clear cut. Explain that a little bit more.
Okay. Corruption is a very, very large subject. It's a very, very, very complex subject. So I'm not sure that I could do it justice in just a few minutes. But let me just highlight some important things. Let me start off by saying that I'm not sure that it is very productive to think about corruption as an issue of morality. It may be, but in terms of analyzing it and trying to solve it, it doesn't get you very far to think in those terms. So if your solution to corruption is, oh, let's get rid of these people and bring in good people, I suggest to you those good people very, very quickly will be acting exactly the same way as the group before. Now, this is anecdotal. This is not a deep analysis, but it might get you thinking a little bit. It doesn't matter how corrupt, how much theft a particular official in one of our African countries is. You never hear that person going to the UK, to Germany, to Canada, or the United States and continuing in their thieving practices, because they're immediately aware that the systems in those countries don't allow them to do that without being caught. Let's go the other way around. The least corrupt countries are the Scandinavian countries. At least they have the reputation for that. But come and see Scandinavian individuals operating in the forests of our African countries as they extract our logs. They behave in very corrupt ways. So it's not as much, I know these are very, very simple anecdotal examples of the individual, but of the environments in which they operate. And in Africa, we tend to have too much power concentrated with too few. And that's a recipe for corruption. Now, what are some of its impacts? If we look at it simply, we might think of it as just a tax. After all, you're going to do a transaction. The man says, "Where's my 10%? You give him his 10%. Nothing is really harmed. It's like a tax." But it's much worse than that, because it actually affects behavior that affects economy. For example, if you travel around African countries, you will typically see a number of public projects, government projects, that are started and never finished. I suggest to you that is a manifestation of corruption at work. The kickback is paid at the beginning of the project or of the contract. When governments change, the new government comes up and says, "Hey, I didn't get anything on this one. Why should I continue to transfer funds for the completion of this? I'll start my own project where I can get my kickback." So rather than that simple theory of our capital investment being the driving force for our economic growth, our capital investment is just dissipated into nothingness. So the impacts of corruption can be much, much larger, and are much larger than just a tax on our transactions. It also changes the emphasis. If we have true competition between firms that are competing for projects, then they spend all of their time trying to better and optimize the costs of the products, of the equipment, of the projects that they deliver. If, however, the reason why you get a project is because you can be trusted, which means you ingratiate yourself into the community circumstance, the social circumstance where you'll be accepted, and you learn to know how much you're supposed to give, what the competition is giving or not giving, and produce your contribution, then as a firm, your expertise is in corruption. It's unlikely that you have much expertise to actually deliver high quality projects. So it distorts the focus of different companies, and it really turns things upside down. I could go on and on and on and on, but let me just say that.
Talk about education a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yes, certainly. But I would say that there, it's not so much an issue of corruption as it is a distortion of the interaction or the relationship with donor countries. So donors set up arrangements to disperse money to the education sector on the basis of primary net enrollment. So the more kids you can get into the classroom, the more and the faster you're going to be able to lay your hands on donor funding to support the education sector. So what we have discovered over the last 20 years or so is that in response to that, many African countries have improved their primary net enrollment very significantly. More kids are going to school, but they end up being functionally illiterate because the quality of education, which isn't a factor that is monitored and which isn't a factor that affects the disbursements of funds, has pretty much collapsed. So you go to our schools, they don't even have classroom furniture. They're writing off of cinder blocks. Some of them are lying on dirt floors, the children, that is. And we are delivering very, very, very poor quality. But if you look at our primary net enrollment, that in fact is very high. So there is no pressure from government to really deliver education. The pressure from government is to deliver high primary net enrollment figures. So you create a distortion in that sector. It's not so much about corruption per se, it's about a response to donor requirements. Of course, I don't blame donors. It is our responsibility to deliver education. They're just assisting. But we have kind of warped that relationship around those kinds of indicators.
I've got two more areas I would like you to touch on. Let's go one at a time. Real estate in West Africa. You were involved with a construction company, I believe, and you implemented some innovative ways in terms of creative financing. Just talk about the real estate sector in West Africa in general, or in developing countries. How can we approach the sector and then leverage it to improve our economies, and what are some of the challenges in there vis-a-vis corruption?
Yes. I included a chapter and went in depth on real estate development in Ghana, and felt that that was quite important to do. Since this is a conversation I hope will be had with the African diaspora, with the next generation, one of the things they find quite difficult to engage with is how you invest in real estate in an environment where we don't have mortgage financing, very, very limited mortgage financing. We have trade finance, short-term loans, and nothing else. So how do you go about developing real estate to be supported by just short-term loans? So I go into detail how we addressed a particular project as a way of communicating. Don't give up. Just the fact that there aren't the standard tools that you find in advanced countries available doesn't mean you can't approach this in innovative ways and achieve the same outcome. So that was the main reason for detailing how we actually achieved that in Ghana, to say, don't be discouraged. The fact that you can't walk into a bank and arrange mortgage financing doesn't mean that there's no opportunity for that. How I feel that corruption impacted that is that innovation was for building of 150 houses. And through that process, it created some efficiencies. It created, if you will, key credibility with certain financing institutions that we thought would be able to address low-income housing. Studies indicated that in Ghana, there is a shortfall of about 2.2 million houses. And this kind of figure you can find across the continent. We just don't have enough housing. So one would think that if there was some chance, obviously part of the reason why we don't have it is because our poor are not able to sustain meaningful debt service payments in order to pay back for the housing. So you'd have to have housing that was much, much, much cheaper than is currently available, and you'd have to have some pretty innovative financing models to address that. I just quickly point out, to give hints, that number one, for most people, their earning capacity increases with time. So if you have a funding mechanism that also increases with time, then such a person should be able to more likely afford. Number two, in most of the countries in Africa, real estate in particular, provided that it's well maintained, so that's something that you have to impose on your project for its lifetime, maintains a value that is closely correlated to the dollar rather than the local currency. What I mean to say is that it does not suffer inflation in the way that other areas do. I probably should have said deflation. So it's not as if you purchase a house for 100 CDs and then next year, yes, you can sell it for 100 CDs, but the 100 CDs is now worth 30% less in dollar term than it was the year before. Real estate tracks the dollar value of the local currencies. So it does mean that if you pay attention to that, take advantage of that, you can facilitate essentially what is long-term financing, and to make sure that the asset that you're financing does not lose value, so that you have a situation of negative. Now, through corruption, we thought we had a formula that would roll out. This was housing for a mining company, a large mining company. They had a number of mines across the continent. They were a leader in gold mining, so many other mining companies would follow their lead. We had found a very useful solution for them in terms of presenting 150 houses, which we finished within 11 months, which we could roll out to all of these mines. And through that size and our economies of scale, apply that to low-income housing. Never given that opportunity. There was just too much harassment due to demands for corruption and for kickbacks and payments that my partner and I decided to walk away from it and end it with that.
So the other issue I want to look at is chronic inflation. Some governments will come to power and without anything to back up the local currency will just engage in massive printing of currency. So talk about this a little bit in terms of how it is corruption, that it might not be clear cut, and how that impacts everything else, including our development.
Again, an answer could be very, very involved. So I will provide a somewhat simple answer to try and get to the core of it. We'll start off with the budget. All of us tend to run pretty large budget deficit. There are technical failures in that we don't seem able to implement systems that guarantee fiscal discipline. But I would say that's the easier problem. That's the focus that donors have had for a couple of decades, and there are many, many tools that can assist you in that process. I think what is far more difficult, and one that parliaments just don't seem able to face up to, is that our entire budget is unable to meet even the most modest expectations of what a government budget should deliver. Let me give you an example. If you take education, clearly a country that is able to educate all of its children, at least to the 12th grade, to university level, has a much better chance of developing than one that can only educate the first 4 years or first 5 years of education. But if you are to take on the responsibility of all 12 years of education, pre-university, you just don't have the funds to do so. How does a politician stand before his people and say, you know what, I won't be able to educate all of your children, at this stage, we can do a decent job with just 60%, but we have a plan over the next 10, 15 years to grow that. So instead, we promise for the entire population. So that would not be good politics. It'd be good economics, but not good politics. And you apply the funds that are available to all 12 years, and you have meaningless education because there's just way too little. It's an exercise that you can do. Take a per capita income, $500 a year, $1,000 a year. These are typical ranges of countries in Africa. Even with a budget allocation of 17% for the education sector, 17% is a very high figure. 18%, go up to 20%. All of those are high figures to allocate to education. And you take the relative population, about 20% who are between the ages of 6 and 18 in any population, and do a ratio to find out how much money is available per student per year. You'll end up with numbers that are so minimal that you know it is impossible for anyone to manage a meaningful education. So there's just a total mismatch between the funds that are available and the resources that we must have. But it's something that we must tackle because in the end, we're not able to reconcile the two and you get inflation. The other thing is the way we contract our natural resources. The reality is that we have contracted with foreign firms to exploit our natural resources in a way that is hugely disadvantageous to us. And so there hasn't been much opportunity for capital formation out of the great wealth of our natural resources. That gets into very complex territory because it brings in geopolitics. It brings in some cases, the violence against our leaders. And of course, the becoming multipolar world suggests that there may be more geopolitical space for that particular area too. Those are just two areas, two examples, I should say, of the type of things that contribute to our never-ending high inflation.
One other stat that I came across in the book that sort of surprised me was the relationship between decentralization and development.
The allocation of resources at the local government level versus the central government level. Yes,
Exactly.
Very, very important point. There actually, there's a clear correlation between whether you are a low-income country, a middle-income country, or a high-income country, and what proportion of public expenditure occurs at local government versus central. In the case of low-income countries, approximately 5 to a maximum of 7.5% of public expenditure occurs at the local government level. There isn't a rich country that allocates so little expenditure at that level. There isn't a poor country that allocates the 30% that rich countries do. So this correlation is very, very, very tight. The more money you spend controlled at the local government, the greater your likelihood of being a developed country. I'd like to point out an important fact. It's not just the amount of money you spend, but also the direction of the lines of accountability. And I'll explain what I mean by that expression. Almost all of our local government chief executives are appointed by a president. So the lines of accountability are from the leadership of the local government to the president of the country. The president hires and fires. Your loyalties will be to the president. Now, where does this come from? There's a historical reason for this, that we never seem to have A, recognized, or B, been able to step away from. In the colonial arrangement, there was no requirement for service delivery for the indigenous people. The job of a colonial government in one of its colonies was to maintain peace and order so that their companies could extract the raw materials and natural resources that the colonial country was interested in. So they would typically appoint district commissioners, and the district commissioner reported to the governor, and the governor reported to, in the case of United Kingdom, to Westminster. And that's how that relationship occurred. When we became independent, we took on that exact same role. So the president appoints the district chief executive. District chief executive line of accountability is back to the president. If you have a major corporation interested in your natural resources, they don't have to deal with the local governments and a varied set of local governments in complex interactions. They just have to influence the center. And once they do, they've captured all of that. How do you reverse the lines of accountability? If you have the district chief executive voted in by the people, then it is the people who are hiring and firing. And that district chief executive is not as interested in pleasing his president as he is in pleasing the people that he now serves. I should add on something else. We do have a weakness in that our people do not demand of their leadership high levels of service delivery, whether it be education or health. And why is that? Because traditionally, they haven't received very much. So they do not have high expectations. They're not indignant when their pregnant wife put into a wheelbarrow is pushed along a pathway and the bridge across the stream has been washed away and nobody has repaired it. Their first thoughts are not to, my goodness, we've got to hold the district chief executive accountable. They're putting our lives at risk, unfortunately, because the expectation was not even to go to the hospital. They did not have high expectations. So it will take time to, if you will, sensitize the people to be more demanding, more realistic in their demands of the levels of service delivery from their leadership. So, in summary, two things. You do need to have much higher levels of expenditure. If you want to be a middle income country, you're talking about 20 to 25% of your public expenditure occur at the local government level. If you're a high $50,000, $60,000 GDP, per capita GDP levels, you're talking 30%. You want to stay poor, then you'll be at 5% to 7.5%. In addition, you'd have to change your lines of accountability away from central government to the people that you're supposed to deliver service to.
So let me go back to the centralization as a result of appointing local officials in different parts of the country. Can we apply the same argument to state-owned enterprises and their boards?
Okay. In terms of corporations, yes. In that, again, the lines of accountability are back to the president. I think with that, it is a little bit more complex, and I would, I think I would need more time. It's not as simple as the central government arrangements. First of all, there's the issue of to what degree is state-owned corporations bordering on a socialist perspective on governance, as opposed to just taking care of the most strategic elements of the economy or even the security agencies or the security aspects of the economy. So that requires a far more nuanced discussion. However, what I would be able to say is that there should be a tendency to as much independence of these corporations, meeting clearly stated objectives. They may not be just profit and value creation, but again, might be related to some service delivery. They must be measurable. To the extent that they are met, then the leadership stays in control. To the extent that they are failing, that is a basis to review, rather than just to point and fire at the whim of the president, which is the way it runs for most countries at this time.
Let's look at the role of the military and its impact on development. What do you think? Military intervention.
I'm not sure I think anything. I've never really thought. I've never really thought about military and its impact on development. I do know that you can have a relatively large standing army. They take a fairly large part of the public purse. So at times, different countries have used the army for agriculture and for other applications outside of true military. But it's not an area I've done much work in. It's not an area I've thought much about. So I'm hesitant to say much more.
I see that. I know you mentioned your interest in soccer. I feel like you've dribbled me around that one. Well, let me come back to a slightly more serious angle on the conversation, Ron. You did go back to Liberia at some point. What led to your return to Liberia? How did you go? What were the circumstances?
Yes. I returned to Liberia in 1997 at the direct invitation of Edwin Holder, who at this time was chairman of the ruling party. Charles Taylor had just won an election in a landslide victory and was the acknowledged president, not a presidency in contention, recognized by ECOWAS, recognized by the world. He was the new president of Liberia. Now, at this time, I had basically what I interpreted to be failure in Ghana and had much success in Nigeria. So I felt that I liked living in Ghana. I've always thought the social dynamics were very, very positive for me. But if you will, I was looking to do things outside of Ghana because I just felt the corruption was overwhelming. It was much too endemic. And the success in Nigeria kind of suggested to me that it was, not that I was naive, I knew there was corruption in Nigeria as well. But at least I'd been able to find one institution for which corruption didn't come into it at all. We put all of our energies and we were the last discount house in Nigeria. And within 2 years, we moved to #1 position in assets and in turnover. It was the only discount house that did not bring European advisors in to set it up. It had been done completely by West Africa. So I felt very, very proud of that achievement. And Liberia had treated me very, very well for the 2 years that I spent there. And I felt that I'd be able to do something. I just went on a visit in 97 in response to Edwin Holder's visit, to talk to a number of people and to see what I might be able to do. In all of my discussions of business, I didn't hear the language of corruption, which I had become very adept at recognizing because of my experience in Ghana. Also, my business partner on the 150 housing development with the mining company in Ghana was interested in expanding beyond Ghana to other countries in West Africa. So I also realized that I had someone with deep pockets who was particularly strong in the area of real estate development. And it's exactly what Liberia needed because the war had been so ravaging to.
And still needs till today, really.
Exactly. So I went there just to go and look. On that first visit, I met my good old friend, Ian Yap, who I was surprised to see him. He was even more surprised to see me. What on earth are you doing in Liberia? My man, what? I was very, very happy to see him. And he had just been made Deputy Managing Director of Liberia Electricity Corporation. He took me back to the LEC yard, one of the devastated. One of the old employees, I believe he worked in the drafting department. He brought me a file. It was my personnel file from whatever that was, almost 20 years before. Very, very touching. They remembered me. It was a real homecoming. And yet there's so much despondency. It had been totally, totally devastated. Just been all torn apart. And I thought, you know what? I think I can help here. I mean, I wasn't coming as that naive, couldn't answer any questions in the interview. I knew something about what LEC was. I could make a difference. So I went back to Ghana and I thought, you know, there are three areas that I feel I could help in Liberia. One was expertise that I still held with the Liberia Electricity Corporation. I would support Ian Yap on that. Two was real estate development. I'd bring in Ghana's largest real estate developer, see what he could do in Liberia. And three, because of my work in Nigeria, I felt that I could bring discount house operations to Liberia and give them a model for raising government funds that were much cheaper than they almost certainly could get on the international markets, and maybe even cheaper and without the conditionalities of the donor community. At that time, they weren't recognized anyway. There's so many sanctions on Liberia. It was unlikely they were going to get it. And what was going to be the source of money? It turns out that as a hedge to inflation and for convenience of purchases from abroad, many people in Ghana, in Nigeria, hold fairly high balances in dollars, but they get no return for it, none. It just sits in checking accounts and they make absolutely no money. So to mobilize such money for 2 or 3% would be fairly straightforward, especially because we believe we have the software, we have the institution, CDL, in order to pull that off. So we could mobilize that money at about 3%. The government of Liberia would probably be able to get it at 5, maybe 6%. Very, very competitive. At that time, the entire government budget was about $40 million. Very, very low. CDL already had an equity close to $1 billion, so it would be in a position to easily raise the kinds of money that would make a difference. I knew that would be a little bit more complicated. I knew that would need direct support from the president, President Taylor. Of course, he was somebody that I developed a relationship in the US with. However, I had decided that if I were to come to Liberia, I would operate with people at my level. I wasn't going to come in and operate as the president's friend and impose myself on. That just did not sit well with me. I thought it was a formula for failure. So I instead worked with, like I said, Ian Yap, with H.Q. Taylor and John T. Richardson at the Public Works Ministry, with Charles Bright at the Central Bank. And I felt I'd be most effective if I operated at that level. That may have been an error. I'm not sure, because in the end, all of my projects went awry. And it appears, I'm not sure of this, but it appears that Mr. Taylor objected to what I was doing.
Okay. Let me come forward now, a full leap forward to the current developments in Francophone Africa, all of these changes. As someone who's spent a lifetime in development, what's your overall view on what's been happening in French West Africa?
Yes, I think Francophone West Africa provides an example of the extreme aspect of the geopolitical dimension that the book makes reference to, that has been the cause of truncated development in Africa. I think it's very telling when Niger moves from earning 80 euro cents per kilo for its uranium to 200 euros. Now, I appreciate that Reuters has said that that is fake news, but two things are certain. Prior to them taking charge of the pricing of their uranium, Niger was one of the slowest growing economies in Africa. After that switch and control of pricing of uranium, and even while it remained under sanctions from ECOWAS, took it to the fastest growing economy on the continent. A direct example of what geopolitical pressures on unfair, unbalanced arrangements in the exploitation of our natural resources. Again, it appears that there is some space opening up in the geopolitical world. And if Africa navigates it intelligently, we can be very good beneficiaries of that. We can get a much fairer allocation of resources for the natural resources, minerals that we provide to the world. So I think those developments are very important. They are dangerous times. Unfortunately, they've occurred around coups d'etats rather than some deliberate appreciation from civil governments and a negotiation of better arrangements, because coups d'etats are also bad news for Africa. So it's not as if this is a clear formula for the way forward. I don't think coups are positive, but I think a recognition of fairer terms in our natural resources are crucially.
So you seem to end the book on a rather optimistic note. You have a lot of confidence in the next generation, and you believe that social media and the internet will help spur this change or this reduction in corruption and turn our countries in the right direction. How so?
Yes, I am hopeful for many reasons. This may sound controversial, but at the time of independence and in my early years, maybe even as late as my teens, there appeared to still be a question mark about the African individual to be able to deliver on the highest levels of technical achievement, managerial achievement, political achievement, etc. Certainly what has happened since then has been a clear demonstration in the United States, in the UK, of the dominance of Nigerian, Liberian, Ghanaian, Ugandan, Kenyan professionals across the world. There is no longer a question about whether the African individual can do it or not. The African individual not only does it, they crush it. So the questions are more about how our societies are arranged, not about the individual. When I look at my own society, in 1989, I talked a lot with my friends, with colleagues, with clients about the cancer of corruption. And I was always attacked. I was crazy. I was a poor businessman. I couldn't succeed in this market, and so I'm using corruption as an excuse. It was just not accepted. Why? Are you not a proud Ghanaian? You want to see corruption? Go and look at the lobbying system in the United States. No, it's not about others, it's about us. Today, there's almost no Ghanaian you'll speak to who does not A, acknowledge that our corruption is endemic, but even more important, ties that corruption to the reason for why our country is in just such dire straits. So I think there is a greater recognition on the demand side, not just the supply side, not just the brilliant economist who sits in the Ministry of Finance, who individually recognizes all the dynamics involved in the detrimental effects of corruption, but has absolutely no impact. This is on the broader population who are the demand side of the services and the governance that will be achieved. So that for me is an important difference. Number two, social media tools have made it much, much easier to demand and receive transparency of our governments. When we look at corruption in particular, corruption is a function of opportunity. So when you look at sole source procurement, you're going to see a lot of corruption because there's a lot of opportunity for corruption. So you look in the places where there is opportunity, you're going to see corruption. But it is has an inverse functional relationship to transparency. The greater the transparency, the less the corruption. Social media offers opportunities for much, much greater transparency. And that's another element as you look out in the future that makes it hopeful to crush this cancer that seems to limit our ability to progress in a deliberate and accelerated way. There is a risk. We have an African diaspora whose next generation is doing very well. I haven't done a full statistical survey, but again, anecdotally, but quite convincingly, most of the next generation have placed an emphasis on education, on professional certification, and run very, very good jobs. If they can stay connected to the continent where not only their future, their identity, their cultural connection exists, but in fact the world's future is, then the sky is the limit. It is my humble hope that a book like this will extend the conversation between the diaspora and the continent, expand the conversation around development, not just confine it to the technical consultants or to the government officials, but allow the demand side of the equation to be far more effective on pressuring a deliberate, untruncated trajectory of development.
Ron Quist, international development expert, businessman, a man of many hats, really. Thank you so much for doing this today.
I thank you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure working with you on this. Thank you.